Oh, if we could dive in some aspects of the book, I would love that. Can we talk about? So one of the essays looks at evolution, and let me ask the big question: did the human brain evolve to think? That's essentially the question that you address in the essay. Can you speak to it?
Sure. The big caveat here is that we don't really know why brains evolved. The, the big why questions are called teleological questions. And in general, scientists should avoid those questions because we don't know really why. We don't know the why. However, for a very long time, the assumption was that evolution worked in a progressive upward scale, that you start off with simple organisms and those organisms get more complex and more complex and more complex. Now, obviously, that's true in some like really general way, right? That life started off as single cell organisms and things got more complex. But the idea that brains evolved in some upward trajectory from simple brains in animals to complex brains in complex animals is called a phylogenetic scale. And that phylogenetic scale is embedded in a lot of evolutionary thinking, including Darwin's, actually.
I'm going to stop there. So that's a clip from a podcast. Lex Friedman is interviewing this woman named Lisa Feldman. And she's a neuroscientist, and I believe she's also a psychologist. And I wanted to start with that clip because I felt like it really addresses the bias within science, or it starts opening up the conversation around the bias of science, and starts asking the question of, are we really that we are we're actually the most complex version of ourselves, in the sense that we think we've reached some sort of pinnacle of evolution. That's kind of a common thing, that like, oh, the caveman was super stupid, and then things got more complicated. We became more evolved and better. And she goes on to saying, I'll let her play it out because it's so great. She talks about how the brain, we had an idea about the brain and how there was like these primal sort of roots or undertones, or not even undertones, but more animal-like parts of our brain, and then other things kind of grew around it as we evolved, which is very just kind of like an anatomically divisive way of looking at things, like just taking pieces apart and saying like, well, this evolved because of this thing, and creating a model in which it's not habitating, but it's actually quite separate. Anyway, she talks about, I'm going to let her talk about it because it makes a lot of sense.
And it's been seriously challenged, I would say, by modern evolutionary biology. And so, thinking is something that, rationality is something that humans, at least in the West, really prize as a great human achievement. And so the idea that the most common evolutionary story is that, brains evolved in like sedimentary rock, with, a layer for instincts, that's your lizard brain, and a layer on top of that for emotions, that's your limbic system, limbic meaning border. So it borders the parts that are for instincts.
Oh, interesting.
And then the neocortex or new cortex, where rationality is supposed to live. That's the sort of traditional story.
So she goes into talking. What she just described is that like we've divided the different parts of our personality and thought processes, and a lot of this is because we covet this idea of thought, or that's how I'm interpreting it anyways, is that like we value thinking so much that we put it at the top. We think that the neocortex is like the bee's knees of the brain, and everything else is kind of like, I don't know, supplementary. I'm gonna let her finish this.
It just keeps getting layered on top,
Right.
by evolution.
Right. And so you can think about, you know, I mean, sedimentary rock is the way typically people describe it. The way I sometimes like to think about it is, you know, thinking about the cerebral cortex like icing on an already baked cake,
Yeah.
you know, where, you know, the cake is your inner beast, these like boiling, you know, roiling instincts and emotions that have to be contained. And the by the cortex, and it's just it's a fiction, it's a myth.
So she's saying that it's kind of a myth that we are we're having this battle between the neocortex and the other parts of our brain, that the other parts of our brain are just these kind of like naive animal parts, and the neocortex has to like control it and make decisions so that we don't, I guess, ruin ourselves through our animal instincts. That maybe potentially, but I love this because, you know, I'm not like I've said this before, I'm not a very good scientific person. This is a developed skill that I'm consciously trying to develop. And what I love about this is it illuminates the bias of a lot of the scientific institution. Now, is it to say, like, I'm not one of those people who throws the baby out with the bathwater. I really don't believe in that type of thinking. I think there's a lot of nuance in life, and we should really appreciate and work with that. But you know, when you look at how much of life is decided around the scientific method and how much we depend on science to make decisions for us, you know, if you are to look at the foundation of how these thought processes are being decided, if they're built on a foundation that's faulty, and I talk about this all the time, that like your values are the way that you should be making decisions, not just out of like, oh, I should or shouldn't do this. It's like, how much logic is actually going through this thought process? How much how much critical thinking are you making around this decision, and how much of is it based around what you know is right versus what you feel necessarily is right? And science, like, if you're in a position where you have to get funding for XYZ things, or you have to kind of fit into the model that is currently there, how advantageous is it for you to challenge some of these things? And how do you go about challenging something like, you know, the way the brain evolved? Man, like, what a huge topic that, like, I mean, my experience of understanding the brain is obviously so small. I've always been fascinated with my own mind. But when you look at the brain, like, I love this idea of looking at the brain, and like thinking that there's this organ inside here. Like, I never really think about it. Do you ever think about your brain? You ever think about that there's like this big, juicy, fucking fruit like thing? I use the word fruit because it's like, it's the closest visual that comes to my mind. It's like an orange that is spongy and alive. And like, I remember one day I was thinking about my brain and I felt different. I felt like I was thinking about something, like I was becoming mindful of my brain rather than mindful of just my mind. Anyways, it was such a trip. I'm gonna play out the rest of this clip because it's so good, and she just gets really clear with her perspective on the brain and science and her approach to it.
It's a myth that you can trace all the way back to stories about morality in ancient Greece. But what you can do is look at the scientific record and say, well, there are other stories that you could tell about brain evolution and the context in which brains evolved. So when you look at creatures who don't have brains and you look at creatures who do, what's the difference? And
I really love this, that like the more you go into um trying to understand like who we are, it really expands your horizon of looking into other biological entities. Like I didn't even know that there was a type of creature that didn't have a brain. And from what my understanding is, you know, and I never thought my study of movement would take me here, but through who have taught me, learning about movement has taught me that the brain has developed in order to complete complex movement. And she goes on to say that the brain was just kind of developed, or brains in general are developed to to uh, to uh, acquire sustenance, and that like depending on your environment and acquire to sustain yourself, the brain develops more complex systems. So she goes on to describe this creature which lives at the bottom of some ocean, and this creature has no brain, and it just sort of floats around, and it's like kind of like a worm type thing, and it sits itself into the into the bottom of the ocean, and it just kind of picks up what's around it. And then when it feels like, oh, there's not enough stuff to pick up around here, it just picks itself up, lets it float around and again and finds a new spot. You compare that to animals on land who have to fight and basically chase down another living creature to eat them. They have to develop senses. And creatures that don't have brains and live at the bottom of the ocean don't have senses, but we do. And I think this is so cool to think about how we developed senses as a way of matter, that our senses are a way for us to um, judge depth of field. It's a way for us to judge whether something is dangerous or not through smell, through shape, through what what kind of sounds they're making. And I love this. And then obviously, if you're going to go and attack something, you need to be able to navigate that interaction well, and it's never going to be like, if you ever watch, I go through this kind of habit where I go and I watch animal hunting videos, and I'll watch like a lion go take down an animal, and man, they are just, it is crazy how much chaos is involved in that situation, like how much they have to, like you know, sometimes they jump on and they roll off, and sometimes they jump on and claw on, and like the animal's still running away and they're trying to like down. um it makes a lot of sense that you would need a lot of um input to do that well, and a lot of practice. And it's no surprise that why animals are always playing, because it's built into their biology that they need to sustain themselves, and they need to figure out how to move in relation to their environment. So it makes me think about how limited we are in our interaction with the things that sustain us, and how even farming, you know, farming is an interesting one. Like farming isn't hunting; it's quite different. Does it make it not um, uh, what's the word? Does it make it not valuable? No. You know, I think it's a really valuable. Obviously, it's helped sustain us for this long, and we needed to provide for more people. Um, but what would it be like if we had, like, what would it be like for our bodies? Okay, like never mind the cultural implications, but just like imagine having to go and run after an animal and and physically take it over and handle it, uh and bring it back somewhere. Like it just feels so much more, so much more sense than this idea of exercise. You know, like exercise is such a weird phenomenon. And it's because we're not animals anymore. We're not doing the things that made us so complex in the first place and why we have a brain in the first place. And I get into this sometimes with my friends where they think like, okay, well, I'm having issues in my mind. What should I do? And I think the more I study this, the more I think that there's almost an existential crisis happening in our brain, that like it's hardwired to acquire things, right? It's hardwired to protect us. It's hardwired to make sure that there's no danger in the environment. And it's there to help us hunt and move and adapt to our environment. And when you're not doing that, it seems to make a lot of sense to me that we would fixate on things that don't matter, because it that's kind of its only function. And it adapts to our environment. So, um, I think that a lot of mental health stuff, in my opinion, this is like I'm not a scientist, and I'm not going to pretend like I have any sort of evidence to back this up. But I believe that if we move more, we're nourishing that part of ourselves that is ancient. Um, and that existential crisis of like, what am I supposed to do, kind of dissolves. And you hear this all the time. People go into the forest, people reconnect with some more natural way of living, and all of their kind of issues or anxieties go away. um so I just think this is really interesting. I'm going to see if there's more of this clip that I can play here. So I'm going to get into she's going to play this part where she talks about this animal that has no brain. It's so cool.
You can look at, some animals. So scientists call an environment that an animal lives in a niche, their environmental niche. What are the parts of the environment that matter to that animal? And so there's some animals whose niche hasn't changed in 400 million years. So they're not, these creatures are modern creatures, but they're living in a niche that hasn't changed much. And so their biology hasn't changed much. And you can kind of verify that by looking at the genes that lurk, in the molecular structure of cells. And so you can, by looking at various animals in their developmental state, meaning you don't look at adult animals, you look at embryos of animals and developing animals, you can piece together a different story. And that story is that brains evolved under the selection pressure of hunting. That in the Cambrian period, hunting emerged on the scene where animals deliberately ate one another. And before the Cambrian period, the animals didn't really they didn't have brains, but they also didn't have senses, really. The very, very rudimentary.
This is so interesting, like that there was an era of time where animals before that didn't have brains and they didn't hunt each other. And I just think about where we are now in terms of like the things that we're navigating right now with the evolution of technology. And there's going to come a point where, and we've already had these, in that like less people write on paper, less people, if any, take pictures with cameras, like film cameras. A lot of people are stop buying stuff from stores. Like, what is the next thing that's going to happen that, in 100 years from now, or even 200,000 years from now, historians or people or another race, alien race, I don't know, is going to look back, just like this woman's looking back at this era, that there was animals that didn't have brains, and there was animals that didn't have senses, and they didn't eat each other. Like, what is that going to be the equivalent of what we're doing now? I'm so fascinated by this. And the development of hunting basically enabled us, or didn't put pressures on us to develop senses. Our senses are a adaptation to the need to, and she talks about this in the interview, the need to understand if something's dangerous or if it's food, and how far away it is. And it's all dependent on the environment. So when I really think about mental health stuff, and I know, what's up, Joe? Joe talks about, we talked about this one time in a chat. Joe Nice, follow Joe Nice, sweet guy. How opportunity or the environment is a big reason why racism is, or why Black people or marginalized communities are having such a hard time kind of getting up. And it's like, when you really think about it, our environment is really the number one thing that decides what we do. You do something different in a playground than you do in a square box. It's like, that's a really silly example, but if you think about our need for adaptation and the way that we adapt, we need a good environment that challenges us to accelerate things that we are needing to get good at. And right now we're not, I've talked about this before, we don't need to get good at anything really. We just need to get good at thinking. And our brains were more designed to understand movement and depth perception and touch and all these things, and we're not using any of it, you know? And, you know, I have a lot of friends who are involved in the, okay, I'll hop on with you, Joe, you know what, Joe, next time, because I gotta hop off soon, but we'll do one next time. I lost my train of thought here, but that's okay. Anyways, it's just a really fascinating discussion around this. I'm gonna let this woman finish her train of thought around hunting.
Senses. So the animal that I wrote about in 7.5 Lessons is called an amphioxus, or a.
First of all, I love ancient words. Amphioxus? Come on. Isn't that the coolest?
Lancelet. And little amphioxus has no eyes. It has no ears. It has no nose.
No eyes, no ears, no nose, no brain. This is a creature that exists like this. And if you look at if you Google any creature that lives at the bottom of the ocean, some of them like have no skeletons. They have they're just existing. And I don't know, I love it.
It has no eyes. It has a couple of cells for detecting light and dark for circadian rhythm purposes. So, and it can't hear. It has a vestibular cell to keep its body upright. It has a very rudimentary sense of touch, and it doesn't really have any internal organs other than this, like, basically stomach. It's like it doesn't have an enteric.
And I love this. I love that she gets into the internal organs. And there's a diagram. I would really look, if you want to look this up, it's Lisa Feldman, Love, Evolution, and the Human Brain on Lex Friedman podcast 140. Yeah, for sure, Joe. We'll make one happen. So I love this because she talks about digestion and the digestive system. If you see the diagram that they've created for this little creature that exists, it's tiny. It's not big. It doesn't really have a digestive system. It's got this kind of, like, and she talks about it, this kind of just tube that goes from the mouth into right to its anus. Like, there's almost no stomach. There's like a little area that it has to bypass. But when we think about our own digestion, how much of what we are evolved to do are we doing? Like, that's a really fascinating question. And when we get really honest with that, are we just completely missing the point of our biology? I find this spiritual.
Nervous system. It doesn't have like a gut that, moves like we do. It just has basically a tube.
Yeah.
So it's like
a little container.
Like a little container, yeah. And really it doesn't move very much. It can move. It just sort of wriggles. It doesn't have and it's this really sweet little animal. It sort of wriggles its way to a spot and then plants itself in the sand and just filters food as the food goes by. And then when the food concentration decreases, it just ejects itself, wriggles to some spot randomly where probabilistically there will be more food, and plants itself again. So it's not really very aware that it has an environment. It has a niche, but the niche is very small, and it's not really experiencing that niche very much.
And I love this idea of understanding that creatures are evolving from their niche. And when I've been coming into this stuff through the lens of movement. And there's a lot of discussion around functional movement. What do we evolve to do? And the primary thing that I would agree with that we're evolved to do is gait, is to walk on 2 feet. And if you're not working at improving your gait, you're probably going to have a hard time in life. But we are able to adapt to our niche. And who's to say that there is the human, right? I don't believe that there is the human. There's obviously thousands, I don't know, millions of different types of humans. I don't really know how to quantify that. Maybe hundreds of thousands, 50,000. But we all have different variations to the same kind of basic structure. Skin color, digestive tract, bone structure, muscular structure, voice, language. Like, these things are all product of what the environment that we are living in. So, why can't movement also be a way of interpreting that environment? And I mean, a really great example, in my opinion, is the Shaolin monks, who, in terms of in my opinion, are the best movers ever, who have ever kind of decided to pursue their life. There's no Shaolin monk that I look at, I'm like, oh, well, that's not good. It's like, no, they've taken their senses and they've taken their physical capacity and they've gone into it completely, and they can do everything. Just because gait is one of the fundamental types of movement doesn't necessarily mean it's the only fundamental movement. This is my opinion. So I don't think it's a bad idea to pursue things like handstands or any sort of martial arts, because if that were the case, then if you go into the wild and you watch a lion jump onto a zebra and try to take it down, like, it's making movements that are other than gait, right? Like, it's doing things different than just running. It's falling over, it's flipping, it's like, it's holding on to something and it's being carried by it. Like, there's a lot of different variables there. So I think, like, this is where I've landed in my understanding, and where I feel passionate about is, like, movement variability is, and this is a common term, I haven't made this up, is the best way to go about it, and improving your ability to do as much movement with integrity as possible, and allow yourself to explore every capacity of movement is a really good decision, with integrity and within your capacity. Anyways, this is my morning rambles this morning. I decided to take a clip and talk about it because I found this clip podcast, particularly fascinating to me. And again, you can look up Lex Friedman podcast 140. This clip, if you look up on YouTube, it's clip at about minute 49. And he's chopped up a few clips from this podcast that you can take a look at. But really check this one out. I really appreciate it. She's got more to talk about. This was only half of this one clip that I wanted to talk about. But yeah, I hope you all have a great day. Happy Monday. Shout out to everyone, because you're awesome. And I love you, and I'll see you tomorrow. How do we close this motherfucker? There we go.